The summer heat lay heavy on San Miguel County. Seek as the dust rising from wagon wheels and the low muttering of the townsfolk gathered outside St. Mary's Chapel. It wasn't often the gossip mill spun with such vigor. But today was special. Today the richest rancher in the county was marrying off his daughter to the poorest man anyone could name. Isabella Herrera marrying him? Lord have mercy, that girl must have done something awful to deserve that fate. A Herrera joining with an Apache shoemaker? Her daddy's out of his mind. Thomas Standing Hog heard every word. He had learned long ago not to flinch at insults. He'd heard worse since the day he turned 17 and took his mother's last name, choosing the truth of who he was instead of the safety of pretending otherwise. But today the words stung differently. Today he was the groom. He stood near the chapel steps, boots worn from work, sleeves rolled just enough to show the strength in his forearms. The jacket he wore was borrowed from a kind widow who insisted a man shouldn't marry in shirt sleeves, no matter how poor he was. The collar felt too tight. The air too still. He kept his gaze forward. He thought he'd prepared himself for this day. He'd been wrong. Because Isabella Herrera was not just any woman. She stepped out of her family's grand carriage like a painting brought to life, black hair braided with white ribbon, dressed the color of wheat at harvest, chin lifted though her eyes were red from crying. She had the kind of beauty that didn't try to charm, it simply was. And she was being given to him like a sack of grain. Her father Don Rafael Herrera gripped her arm tightly, guiding her toward the chapel doors. His expression was stone. His mustache groomed to perfection. His clothes finer than anything found within 100 miles. Only someone looking closely would notice the faint tremor in his gloved hand. Thomas noticed. He knew. In the inner pocket of Thomas's borrowed jacket was a folded piece of paper, the ledger page he'd found hidden inside Don Rafael's boot while repairing the sole. Evidence of money stolen from the community funds meant to help poor ranchers through a drought. He hadn't meant to discover it. But once he'd seen it, the truth burrowed into him like a burr under skin. He hadn't decided what to do yet. Before he could, Herrera arrived at his workshop with an offer. No an ultimatum. You will marry my daughter. You will become part of my family. And you will forget what you found. Thomas had refused. Isabella had cried. The deal was already done. In Kansas territory, a powerful Hispano rancher could make a poor Apache man vanish like soap. So Thomas chose the only path that kept him alive. Now Isabella approached him with steps that faltered only slightly. She kept her eyes down, jaw clenched tight. Thomas could feel her dread pulsing off her like heat from a branding iron. When she reached him, she finally looked up. He wished she hadn't. There was so much fear in her eyes he felt sick with guilt. The priest cleared his throat. Shall we begin? They stood before the chapel door, before God and town and gossiping tongues, hands joined because tradition demanded it. Not because they wanted it. Isabella's fingers were cold as river stone. Thomas lifted his chin. At Thomas Standing Hog, he said, voice steady though his chest tightened, swear before God and these people to take Isabella Herrera as my wife, to love her, protect her and care for her for as long as I draw breath. A murmur rippled through the crowd. They had not expected tenderness from him. Thomas meant every word, but not because he believed she wanted him. He said it because she deserved someone to speak gently to her on this cursed day, even if it could never change her heart. Isabella's lips parted. She seemed startled by the vow. Then she swallowed, looked at the ground and whispered her own lines so softly Thomas barely heard them. The ceremony ended quickly. Don Rafael kissed his daughter's forehead like she wore a burden finally lifted. Then he placed her hand into Thomas's palm. You will treat her well, he said loud enough for the crowd, though only Thomas caught the cold edge in his tone. And you will stay silent. Thomas nodded once. The carriage rolled away, dust curling through the dry Kansas air. Isabella stood beside Thomas, her wedding veil trembling in the wind. She didn't look at him. She didn't look anywhere. Just stared straight ahead as if still hoping to wake up from a nightmare. Thomas cleared his throat. My house is small, he said quietly, but it's clean and safe. No answer. I'll take care of you, Isabella. Still nothing. He felt her slipping away into some private despair he could not reach. He wanted to say something, anything to ease her fear. But what comfort could a poor Apache orphan offer a woman raised among chandeliers and imported rugs? He picked up their modest luggage and began walking. After a moment Isabella followed, skirts brushing the dusty ground. The walk to his home took only 10 minutes, but it felt like an hour. His cabin was humble, a one-room place with a narrow loft, a tin roof patched in 3 places and a small porch shaded by a cottonwood tree. Isabella stared at it as though she'd been sentenced to live in a hollow log. Thomas pushed open the creaking door. "Welcome," he said softly. Her chin trembled, but she stepped inside. She didn't see him clench his fists behind her, didn't see how it hurt him to watch her disappointment. All she knew was her life had been torn from her hands and placed in his. And all he knew was that this marriage was built on a lie so deep it could drown them both. Outside the sun sank behind the Kansas plains, turning the sky copper and gold. Inside a tiny cabin 2 strangers stood in the half-light, bound together by vows neither had chosen and a secret that would change everything once it finally came to light. The first night in Thomas's cabin passed with a silence so thick it felt like a third person standing between them. Isabella sat on the edge of the narrow bed, hands folded in her lap, staring at the wooden floor as if it might open and swallow her whole. Thomas, unsure of what a new husband was supposed to do, especially one who wasn't wanted, busied himself lighting the oil lamp and setting her valise on a small chest. It could feel dread rolling off her like heat from a campfire. It tightened his throat, made him choose every movement carefully. "You can take the bed," he said quietly. "I'll sleep on the floor or outside if it makes you more comfortable." He meant it. They slept in worse places, barn lofts, riverbanks, jail cells once when a marshal mistook him for a horse thief. But Isabella looked at him as if she didn't know whether to believe him. "This is our wedding night," she said in barely more than a whisper. "Isn't there something expected?" Thomas stiffened. "Expected?" "Yes, in the eyes of the church." "Want it?" "No, not like this." He shrugged off his jacket and holster belt, set them gently aside, then began unbuttoning his shirt. Isabella squeezed her eyes shut so fast he almost laughed from pure disbelief. "Relax," he muttered, "I'm just trying to breathe. These collar's choking me." He sat down on the far side of the bed, leaving several feet of space, and lay on his back with a sigh of exhaustion. When Isabella didn't move, he turned onto his side, giving her his back. She hesitated, then asked, voice tied with fear, "Why aren't you doing anything?" Thomas stared at the wall. "Because I'm not the kind of man who takes what isn't given. Because you're frightened and your father used you like cattle at auction. Because I'm not a monster. But he only said I don't have feelings for you and you don't want me. So don't do anything foolish to prove otherwise. Go to sleep." He heard her sharp intake of breath. They suck. The clinician and knew she was wondering if he somehow knew the truth behind their marriage. He didn't turn around. He didn't stir. The night settled heavily. After a long while Isabella lay down too, as far from him as the mattress allowed. They fell asleep like children hiding from thunder, curled, tinsy, desperate not to touch. The days that followed weren't much easier. Isabella tried to play the role of wife, cooking, cleaning, tending to the small chores she'd seen other farm wives perform, but she'd never had to do any of it before. Her mother's servants had always prepared meals. Her father had insisted his daughters be ladies, not laborers. So, the first pot of beans she made burned solid to the bottom. The second boiled over and doused the stove, no flame. The third tasted like ashes. Thomas arrived home from work to the smell of scorched beans and sighed. "Isabella," he said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "What did the beans do to deserve this violence?" She planted her hands on her hips. "He followed the directions in your awful cookbooks." "Those aren't cookbooks. Those are receipts for flour and salt." "Well, maybe label things properly." Thomas blinked. Then, despite himself, he laughed. A short, surprised laugh that made her cheeks flush. She glared. "Don't laugh at me." "I'm not," he said, still smiling. "I'm laughing at this situation. Lord, you could burn water. Maybe your stove is broken. Or maybe you're broken." Her jaw dropped. "Excuse me?" "Never mind." He rolled his eyes and grabbed the skillet. Move aside before you hurt something. Later that evening, as they ate the simple stew he had thrown together, Isabella muttered, "It's not that good." I scooped another spoonful. "Better than your bean massacre." "You re awful." "You started it." For a moment, their eyes met and something not quite hostile flickered between them, something lighter, something almost like the amusement. The next morning, Isabella tried again. She swept the floor, raising more dust than she settled. She washed his shirt, shrinking one and stretching the other. She attempted to mend a tear in his sleeve, but the stitching came out crooked and lumpy. When Thomas saw it that evening, he stared at the sleeve, then at her. "Did you sew this with your eyes closed?" He tried. "That's the problem. You tried. And you think you could do better?" "I know I could." "Then do it." But they glared at each other so fiercely the cabin might have caught fire from pure stubbornness. Then, unexpectedly, Thomas chuckled. "You re something else, Isabella." "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "More of an observation." She didn't realize she was smiling until she felt it. So many nights passed like this, awkward, prickly, full of misunderstandings, but also small moments of warmth. Isabella began learning the rhythm of the household, when Thomas returned from work, how he preferred his tools arranged, which shelves creaked loud enough to wake him. Thomas, in turn, noticed the details she tried to hide, the way she flinched when thunder cracked, the way she held her breath before she opened a pot, terrified she'd ruined another meal, the way she secretly touched the wildflowers she'd placed in a jar on the table, as if reminding herself that beauty still existed even here. He admired her for it, quietly, secretly. One evening, as dusk bled into the Kansas prairie, Thomas came home to find Isabella perched on the porch steps, knees drawn up to her chest, looking at the horizon. He paused. "Something wrong?" She shook her head without looking at him. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just trying to understand how my life ended up here." He sat on the step below hers. "I could ask myself the same." Silence settled comfortably this time, unexpectedly soft. Isabella finally spoke. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" Thomas glanced at her profile in the golden light, delicate, determined, wounded. "Every day," he said honestly, "but wishing doesn't fix anything." She wrapped her arms around her legs. "I wasn't meant to marry someone like you." He wasn't offended, not really. "And I wasn't meant to have a wife at all." They turned toward each other at the same time. For the briefest second, their eyes locked, no anger, no bitterness, just two souls equally lost. Something fragile shifted between them. Neither spoke of it. Neither dared. But in that moment, on that quiet porch, the distance between a rich rancher's daughter and a poor Apache shoemaker grew just a little smaller. And neither of them quite knew what it meant yet. Summer settled heavy over San Miguel County, turning the air thick with heat and cicada buzz. Days lengthened. Night softened. And somewhere between burned suppers and reluctant laughter, Isabella began to learn the rhythm of her new life and Thomas began to learn the rhythm of her. It happened slowly, like dusk folding into night. Isabella woke before sunrise one morning to the sound of hammering behind the cabin. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. A pale orange glow clung to the edges of the sky. And Thomas stood shirtless at his workbench, muscles taut under the bronze light as he carved at a block of leather. She froze, unsure why her breath hitched. He didn't look up. "You're awake early. What are you making?" she asked, moving closer. "A pair of riding boots," he said, nodding toward the shaped leather pieces. "Someone from town put in an order." "You do this every morning?" "When there's work." He glanced at her. "And when there's no work, I do it anyway." She folded her arms against the chill. "Why?" "To keep my hands from remembering the wrong things." He didn't explain. She didn't ask. But his words lodged in her chest. She sat on the porch steps and watched him work, the steady movement of his hands, the care with which he stitched, as though each seam carried a story. When he finished molding the leather to the boot form, he wiped his brow and finally looked at her fully. "You hungry?" he asked. She hesitated. He burned the bread again. He smelled it. He said without judgment. We have jerky instead. She groaned. If I have to chew one more piece of that leather-tasting stuff, my jaw will fall off. Thomas smirked. Lucky for you, I made biscuits yesterday. Her head snapped up. You made biscuits? I know, he said drily. Imagine the shame. She laughed, warm and real. Thomas blinked as if the sound startled him. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh without bitterness lining it. A motion toward the door. Come on. Over breakfast biscuits, jerky, and strong black coffee, Isabella found herself studying Thomas when he wasn't looking. The way he moved quietly through the tiny cabin, how he always made sure she had the softer chair, how he set aside the best biscuit without ever saying it was for her. None of it matched the men the town whispered about. None of it matched the men she'd prepared herself to hate. At one point, she noticed his sleeve mended neatly where she'd botched it days before. You fixed it, she said softly. Is shrugged. Didn't want you thinking you'd ruined something. She stared at him. You didn't have to spare my feelings. Didn't do it for your feelings, he muttered. Then, after a beat, well, maybe a little. Her chest warmed unexpectedly. Life settled into an uneasy peace. Isabella learned to make cornbread that didn't resemble wagon wheels. Thomas taught her how to milk the goat without getting kicked. She learned which herbs grew wild near the creek and how to collect them before the sun burned them dry. In return, she taught Thomas bits of Spanish, though he already knew more than he admitted. He taught her Apache words quietly, reverently, never in public, where tongues were sharp and prejudices sharper. They still argued plenty. Isabella was stubborn as a mule, and Thomas was only slightly less so. But their arguments had edges softened by familiarity now. One afternoon, after she nearly chopped off her thumb learning to split kindling, Thomas grabbed her wrist. Give me that, he said, taking the hatchet. You're going to take your whole hand next. I'm learning, she protested. You're trying too hard. And you're impossible. He crossed his arms. That is 1 to no 1. She lunged to grab the hatchet back. He held it out of reach, amused. She glared. He chuckled. You're not cut out for chopping wood. Then what am I cut out for? He stopped laughing. A long silence stretched between them, heavy, searching. She waited for him to say something cruel or dismissive. Instead, he said simply, plenty of things, but not everything comes all at once. She wasn't sure why that sentence made her throat tighten. One evening, after a long day of mending fences and boiling stew, Thomas suggested they sit on the roof, the only place where a breeze cut through the heat. He climbed up first, then reached down to offer his hand. Isabella hesitated before taking it, his palm sending a strange shiver up her arm. They sat side by side, legs dangling over the edge, watching the Kansas sun melt into shades of copper and rose. It's pretty, she murmured. M-H-M. You don't think so? I see it every day. That doesn't make it less beautiful. He glanced at her, then really looked. Guess not. A quiet settled between them, the kind that didn't suffocate. Isabella tilted her head back to watch the sky burst into stars. Do you ever miss something, even if you can't name it? All the time, he said. What do you miss? My sister, he said after a long pause. Maria. She died in the drought years ago. She was only 12. Never complained once. Even when she went to bed hungry more nights than not. Isabella's breath caught. I'm sorry. She'd have liked you, he murmured. She liked stubborn people. Isabella's lips curved. I don't know whether to take that as an insult. Up to you. She nudged his shoulder gently. He didn't move away. Hours passed like minutes. The starlight reflected off her hair, and for the first time, Thomas allowed himself to acknowledge that she was beautiful. Not in the delicate way of the wealthy, but in the resilient way of someone learning to live a life she never chose. Isabella shivered slightly in the night air. Without thinking, Thomas draped his jacket around her shoulders. Their eyes met. Something unspoken flickered there. Fragile, tentative, dangerous. Thank you, she whispered. He swallowed. You're welcome. But his chest felt tight, because he knew dangerously well how easily affection could turn into something deeper, and how impossible their situation already was. Still, neither moved away. The sky stretched wide above them, and the night held its breath. Because something had shifted quietly, irrevocably. Not love, not yet, but something real. And neither of them was quite ready to name it. The first signs of autumn came early that year. The heat eased, the wind sharpened, and the cottonwoods near the creek began turning gold at their edges. With the change of season came a change between Thomas and Isabella, subtle at first, then unmistakable. They moved around each other differently now. He didn't flinch when her elbow brushed his. She no longer stepped aside like he carried some invisible fire. The cabin felt smaller, not because it trapped them, but because something warm filled the spaces once held by silence. Still, the truth haunted them both. Thomas could feel it every time Isabella looked away too quickly, every time fear crossed her expression when Don Rafael's rider passed by on the road. The secret she carried weighed on her shoulders like an iron yoke. And every day she didn't confess sharpened the blade of guilt behind her ribs. For Thomas, the truth lived differently, in the pocket of a coat he kept hidden beneath the floorboards. A single page worn soft by his thumb. The numbers scribbled across it. The damning signature. Every time he touched the handle of that coat, his chest ached. It didn't want that page to exist anymore. Not since he began caring for Isabella in ways he hadn't meant to. One night, a sudden thunderstorm rolled across the plains, lighting the sky in violent flashes. The wind rattled the shutters, and the cabin creaked as if the storm were trying to peel the walls open. Isabella paced the floor, jumping at every crack of thunder. "You all right?" Thomas asked from the table, polishing a boot. She wrapped her arms around herself. I don't like storms." He watched her carefully. "It's just noise and light. They pass." "Not all storms pass," she whispered, staring at the window. "Some stay." He set the boot aside. Isabella. But whatever she was about to say died on her tongue. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, the fear there, the guilt carved deep. Something inside Thomas tightened. He stood, closing the space between them before he could second-guess himself. "You've been carrying something heavy," he said gently. "A long time." Her throat bobbed. "Thomas, you don't owe me anything." "Not words, not explanations." He lowered his voice. "But you don't have to carry it alone." She looked at him, then really looked. His face softened, the sternness gone, replaced with a steadiness she'd learned to trust without meaning to. Her lips parted, trembling. "If I tell you, you'll hate me." "I don't hate easily." "But you will," she whispered. He shook his head. "Try me." The storm cracked above them, rattling the windows. She flinched, and then something in her broke clean through. Her shoulders sagged. Her breath hitched sharply. And she said it. "All of this marriage, it happened because my father forced it. Not just because he wanted to control my future, but because of what you found. The ledger. He was terrified you'd expose him." Thomas didn't move. Isabella's voice cracked. "I was the payment to keep you silent." He let out a long, slow breath. "I know." Her face crumpled. You knew? From the moment you came down the aisle and couldn't look at me. From the moment your father's hand shook when he gave mine yours." His voice was soft, but steady as bedrock. "I knew, Isabella." She stared at him, devastated. "Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were already drowning." He brushed a loose strand of hair away from her cheek. "And I couldn't bring myself to push you under." Her breath caught. "I thought you hated me," she whispered. "I never hated you." He stepped closer, not even for a heartbeat. Lightning flared. Thunder rolled. But the storm outside felt smaller than the storm between them. Isabella's voice trembled. "I don't want to lie anymore." "Then don't." She swallowed hard, then pressed a hand to her chest. "I was so afraid of losing you, of hurting you, of becoming the kind of person my father is." Thomas cupped her cheek gently. You are nothing like him. She shuddered at his touch. You should have sent me back. I should have, he admitted, but I didn't. Why? He hesitated for only a moment. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a burden forced on me, and started seeing you as he exhaled. Someone I didn't want to lose. Her eyes glistened. She stepped closer, so close her breath warmed his jaw. Thomas, she whispered, voice trembling with truth. I think I've been falling for you since the day you fixed my terrible sewing and didn't laugh at me. I did laugh, but not cruelly. He smiled faintly. No, not cruelly. Outside, the storm crashed like a breaking whirlwind howling, rain pounding, lightning splitting the sky wide. Inside, the cabin glowed softly in lamplight, and their shadows leaned toward each other like two trees bending in the same wind. Isabella rested her forehead against his chest. I'm sorry for everything. For what my father these did. For hurting you. Thomas wrapped his arms around her. Hair slow, deliberate, gentle. You didn't hurt me. Edith. She clung to him, trembling. What will we do? We'll tell the truth, he murmured. Her breath caught. It'll destroy him. It'll save you. And us, she whispered. Thomas lifted her chin with careful fingers. He kissed her, slow, certain, full of promise. When he pulled back, he said softly, whatever happens next, we face it together. The storm raged on, but for the first time, Isabella wasn't afraid because she wasn't facing it alone. The storm that raged through the night finally broke near dawn, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet dust and cottonwood bark. Sunlight crept through the cabin window in soft stripes, and Thomas woke to find Isabella still curled against him. Her breath warm against the fabric of his shirt. For a moment, he simply watched her sleep. She looked younger and rest, stripped of the guilt and tension she wore like armor. Her lashes trembled softly. A strand of hair had fallen across her cheek, and he brushed it away with a gentleness no one in town would recognize as belonging to a man like him. He wasn't sure what the day would bring, but he did know one thing for certain. The truth was no longer something he could keep tucked beneath a floorboard. Isabella stared, eyes blinking open. She looked up at him, uncertain, until he offered a small smile that eased the fear in her gaze. Morning, he said quietly. She stretched slightly, the blankets rustling. Morning. A beat passed before reality returned to her fully, and her expression tightened again. We said we'd tell the truth today. We will, he promised, but not alone. Her eyes flicked to his. Thomas, he's my father. And you're my wife. She swallowed hard. I'm afraid. I know. He brushed his thumb over her knuckles, but courage isn't the absence of fear. It's carrying truth anyway. She nodded, though her hands trembled. They washed, dressed, and stepped outside. The ground squished under their boots, the kind of wet that soaked through leather and soul alike. Eager above, hawks circled in the brightening sky. Thomas saddled their old Mustang, while Isabella gathered her shawl. Her eyes lingered on the ranch road that led toward the Esteban estate, a place that she'd grown up running through with bare feet and laughter, a place she now approached with her husband beside her. That road in silence. When the house came into view, the tall adobe walls, the carved wooden balcony, the cross above the archway, Isabella's breath hitched. She could picture her father inside, slamming his palm on the table the way he did whenever he felt cornered. Thomas reached over and squeezed her thigh lightly. I'm with you. She nodded, holding the reins tighter. They dismounted. A ranch hand stepped forward to take the Mustang, hesitated when he saw Isabella's expression, then stepped aside without a word. Inside, the house was dim, cool, full of shadows and heavy furniture polished by generations of Esteban pride. Her father sat at the head of the long table, morning coffee in hand. Stacks of correspondence before him, like he had not a single worry in the world. Don Rafael looked up. His expression darkened instantly. You, he said to Thomas, you dare step foot in my house? Thomas didn't answer, but Isabella did. Papa, she said softly, we need to speak. Don Rafael's jaw clenched. If this is about that Apache boy, he's my husband, she cut in. A muscle twitched in his cheek. Thomas stepped forward. We're not here to argue you. We're here because the truth has waited long enough. Don Rafael stood so suddenly, his chair scraped against the floor. You keep your mouth shut. You should have paid someone else to take that ledger off your hands, someone without a conscience. Isabella flinched. Thomas didn't. He slid the folded paper from his coat and set it on the table. Don Rafael paled at the sight of it, color draining from his face like water from cracked clay. Rafael Esteban, Thomas said evenly, you stole from the people who work your land, widows, old men, families who barely make it through the winter. You lied in the town ledgers. You pocketed what wasn't yours. Her father's voice shook with fury. You think anyone will believe a breed over me? Yes, Isabella whispered, because I will stand with him. Rafael's head snapped toward her. Isabella. No, she said firmly. You sacrificed my happiness to save your name. You married me off without my consent. You lied to the town, to Mama, to your workers. She swallowed, her voice trembling. And Thomas still protected me, still tried to spare me. Rafael stared at her, stunned, because she had never seemed to him this way, never raised her voice, never looked him in the eye like she wasn't a frightened child anymore. You would betray your own blood, he said hoarsely. I am not betraying you, she whispered. I am setting you from your leash. The room was silent, but for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Thin footsteps sounded in the doorway. Sheriff Grant stepped in, hat in hand, flanked by 2 deputies. The worn leather of his belt creaked when he shifted. Rafael Esteban, the sheriff said solemnly, there have been complaints, more than a few, and evidence brought forward. He nodded toward Thomas. We have to take you in for questioning. Don Rafael staggered backward like he'd been struck. You set me up, he snarled at Thomas. You poisoned her against me. Thomas didn't speak. He simply placed his hand gently behind Isabella's back. She sees clearly now, he said. That's what frightens you. The sheriff stepped closer. See. Rafael looked at Isabella one last time, not as a father, not even as a man accused, but as someone who had lost every ounce of control he'd built his life around. His voice cracked. I did this for you. She shook her head. No. You did it for your pride. The deputies let him out. And for the first time in her life, Isabella didn't follow him. The house felt hollow after he was gone. Isabella stood in the empty parlor, trembling. Thomas stepped close, touching her elbow gently. You okay? She nodded, though tears streaked down her cheeks. I did the right thing, didn't I? See, he whispered, brushing her tears away with his thumb. You did. I feel like I just lost him. Thomas wrapped an arm around her. Sometimes you lose someone before you ever admit it. She leaned into him, finally letting herself cry. Not for her father, but for the girl she used to be, silent, obedient, trapped in a house full of rules. Thomas held her until her sobs quieted, until her breathing steadied, until the trembling stopped. Then he tilted her chin up. You will not face the rest alone, he said. She looked at him with new strength behind her eyes. I know. Outside, the sun climbed higher, spreading warm light across the Esteban land. A reckoning had come, but something new was beginning. Winter settled over Kansas that year like a heavy quilt, thick, unmoving, unyielding. Townsfolk talked about it for more decades afterward, the way the cold seeped through every board in every house, how the wind howled like a wolf that refused to leave. For Isabella and Thomas, it was a winter of waiting, waiting for Don Rafael's trial, waiting for the town to stop whispering behind gloved hands, waiting for something resembling peace to grow in the cracks left behind. Their cabin, small as it was, became a refuge against the bitter weather. Snow piled up against the door some mornings high enough that Thomas had to shovel just to step outside. Nights were long, the kind where the fire had to be coaxed every few hours, or the cold would snuff it out entirely. But for the first time, they faced winter together, not as 2 strangers forced into marriage, but as something resembling partners, maybe even more than that. On nights the wind screamed and rattled the shutters, Isabella would sit by the hearth, sewing. Her feet tucked beneath a thick blanket. Thomas would mend boots or carve small pieces of cedar into little shapes, horses, birds, things her mother once collected. Sometimes their knees brushed. Sometimes their fingers touched when passing a cup. Sometimes they sat so close the warmth between them felt deeper than fire. The town whispered about Rafael Esteban's fall, about Isabella living as the wife of a poor apache shoemaker, but surprisingly, few people came to their door with judgment. If anything, many began to bring work to Tomas regularly, quietly, respectfully. A pair of worn cavalry boots, a lady's riding shoes, a harness strap, someone claimed only Tomas could repair right. It didn't make them rich, but it kept their table full, and that was enough. In late February, the trial concluded. Rafael Esteban was given un year in county jail and ordered restitution. Many said he'd gotten off lightly because of his family name. Others said a year was enough to humble any proud man. Isabella sat through every hearing. She listened to testimony, avoided townsfolk's pitying eyes, and left court holding Tomas's hand like a lifeline. Her father never looked at her. Not once. But the day he was taken away, chains clinking against frozen ground, he paused, just for a second, and his eyes found hers. Not with anger this time. Not with pride or disappointment. But something far more fragile. Grief. She didn't run to him. She didn't break down. But a part of her heart cracked open in acknowledgement of the complicated love between a daughter and a father who'd lost himself somewhere along the way. Afterward, Tomas guided her outside, steady as a fence post in a gale. You did what was right, he murmured. I know, she whispered. But right doesn't always feel good. Tomas understood that better than most men. Spring arrived late that year, cautious at first, then suddenly, as if it had been waiting for the exact moment the world was ready. The creek thawed. The grass pushed through thawing soil. The cottonwoods wore a thin veil of green. One bright morning in early April, Isabella felt the sun warm on her face for the first time in months, and decided she was ready to visit the jailhouse. Tomas didn't stop her. He didn't insist on coming. He simply said, I'll be here when you get home. Inside a small stone building, Rafael Esteban sat behind iron bars, thinner than she remembered, shoulders bent under a weight that wasn't physical. He looked up when she approached. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Isabella said softly, I came because you're still my father. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Isabella, I failed you. The word sounded painful, dragged up from some deep place he'd never allowed anyone want to see. I did what I did thinking I was protecting the Esteban name, protecting our land. But all I protected was my own pride. He stared at the floor. And in doing so, I harmed the one person who deserved better. Isabella's breath caught. He looked up again, eyes raw. I am sorry, hija. She reached through the bars and took his hand. It was rougher than she remembered, colder. I forgive you, she whispered, but I won't forget. And I won't let you forget, either. He nodded slowly, as if accepting a sentence heavier than the judge's. When spring ripened into full bloom, Rafael was released early for good behavior and returned to the land he once ruled with iron certainty. But this time, he returned humbled. He didn't go back to his grand estate. He came to Tomas and Isabella's cabin first. Tomas stepped outside when he saw the older man approach. The two stared at each other. No challenge. No pleading. No old grudges. Used two men with the same woman tied to their futures. Rafael cleared his throat. Tomas, thank you for taking care of my daughter. Tomas nodded. She takes care of me just as much. Something like a smile tugged at the older man's mouth, a smile, worn, but real. Inside the cabin, Isabella waited. When her father stepped in, she embraced him gently. No one spoke for a long time. The past didn't disappear that day, but something new rooted itself slow, tender, like the first green shoots of spring. A beginning. By summer, the three of them found a rhythm. Rafael helped around the cabin, more than his pride would admit, building a new chicken coop, mending fences, teaching Isabella recipes her mother once made. Tomas expanded his boot-making shed with lumber neighbors offered freely, grateful for how he'd stood up for the community's rights. Isabella tended a small herb garden behind the cabin, the earth rich and warm beneath her fingertips, a reminder that new life always followed winter. On one golden July evening after supper, she and Thomas sat on the cabin roof, as they once had legs dangling, bottle between them, stardust spilling thick across the sky. She leaned her head against his shoulder. We made it through. It wrapped an arm around her waist. We did, hija. Thomas. MHM? I love you. It turned her face toward his, kissed her sweetly, deeply, like a promise renewed. I love you, to, Isabella. Since before either of us admitted it. Below them, lantern light glowed warm in the windows. Inside, her father set dishes to dry and hummed an old Hispano hymn she hadn't heard since childhood. Above them, the prairie stretched wide and endless, caught witness to a life rebuilt from broken places. And for the first time in her 22 years, Isabella knew she wasn't standing between two worlds anymore. She was finally home. If this tale of redemption, courage, and unexpected love touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and share the story so more folks can ride along with Thomas and Isabella. Your support keeps these frontier tales alive.